Welcome, everyone, to a brand new episode of the Jamsty Podcast 1991 Retrospective, a brand new and the final episode of the 1991 Retrospective. We are going to be talking about a Titanic album we've saved for last, which is My Bloody Valentine's Shoegaze opus, Loveless.
Indeed. Well, it's come to this. 17, this is the 17th video, which is by far the longest series we've made. I mean, we like that we've made many series, but like still, this has been, a project that's been ongoing for a long time. And I always felt that it would be fitting to finish with an album like this that's emblematic of a lot of the kind of alternative aspects of 1991, but also in many ways didn't really become the cultural titan that it is until sort of much after its initial release.
And it's going to be doubly fitting because we are releasing this exactly on this album's 30th anniversary on November 4th.
Exactly. So fucking hallelujah that worked out. I only realized that the other day, actually, which is beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
But yes, so when you see this album will be 30, and it's an album that's kind of dominated sort of culture. It's an album with a lot of cultural baggage, especially if you're an online music person. Like, it's an album that's associated with that particular kind of 4chan core set of records, like In the Airplane Over the Sea, which we've also reviewed this year in a different series, and like Lift Your Skinny Fists, and it's part of like kind of online music core in a certain sense. And so with that comes, I think, a good deal of baggage when it comes to approaching a record like this, trying to talk about it, trying to rationally, express how we feel about it. And the
inevitable backlash to an album like this as well, which is more and more popular with every gaining year, I see.
Which is just like so bizarre to me. Like, I get why someone would put, would say, "Oh, this is a canonical
just
record."
Distorted guitars. What is bad? It doesn't sound good.
I could see why, if this is a sort of sound that you're not familiar with, it can be alienating when you put it on, because like these, at their core, quite simple songs, like quite simple sort of guitar strummed chords, like. But that's not the point of any of these songs. The point is the fucking effects, the Titanic world that this album creates, that elevates these songs into something beyond just, lo-fi, sort of indie, pop song, but into into kind of these quite abyssal, huge Titanic waves of sound and emotional expression that, quite famously, it completely bankrupted the label that financed it, and cost, I think, like $250,000 to record this album.
God.
Which is kind of even for like 1991, which obviously inflation has changed the value of that, but like that was an astronomical amount of money if you think about it for an album, especially an album like this, where like it's not exactly a thing that's going to have mass appeal, is it? But 1991 was a different time, obviously. MBV were riding off the high of their heavily buzzed and quite solid and strong debut record, Isn't Anything. Also, their selection of EPs they'd released as well, including the infamous You Made Me Realize, which has become their kind of iconic live song when they perform it as 30-minute noise renditions. But all that aside, Loveless comes with a certain level of cultural baggage and expectation and all this sort of relationship that people have to it. And so we're going to try and talk about how this record sounds to us, what we think the significance of it is. And I'd love if we could kind of try and talk about that a little bit as well, to kind of wrap up the retrospective. And just how it holds up, the effect this record has on each of us, like what kind of state of mind it puts you in to listen to it. Because to me, when I hope you would agree, when you listen to this record, it's very much the kind of album that sort of dominates your mental space. Like, it's very difficult. I mean, I don't know, maybe people will disagree, but I find it very difficult to put this on as background music. Like, when I put this on, maybe I could, do other things, but like, it's so just demanding of like all of my cognitive energy and it kind of sucks you into this whole world, if that makes any sense. I know that's kind of a crazy way to describe music, but it does kind of pull you into this sonic world that, you know, if that's a place you don't want to inhabit, or if that's a place you find unpleasant, you're not going to have a good time with this album. But if you're able to get into this kind of like plane of bliss that this album, I think, tries to pull you into, then there's simply nothing else like it. Anyway, love to hear from you guys now.
Well, as the resident shoegaze enjoyer, this is obviously kind of a big album. I think this was, technically speaking, like the first album in the genre that I had ever actually heard. And I will freely admit, the wave of shoegaze that My Bloody Valentine actually operate in is kind of not exactly the area of the genre that I gravitate towards. You know, obviously I'm the dream poppier, slow divier kind of aspect of the music, or when you throw it into a genre mashup like black gaze or something, that's typically more my speed. But I don't really have a, I mean, depending on how you look at this album, considering how highly rated and beloved it is, I guess you could consider what I have to say a bit of a hot take, but I do think the album is very good. I really, really enjoy it. I think that it's so easy to see why it holds the cultural importance that it does. And it's easy to see why so many people enjoy it. And while I definitely also just kind of like, I can see why someone wouldn't it's not exactly something that has like a universal appeal to it. I still don't really find myself sympathizing with the, oh, this is like bad takes. Like, I can't even really get into a frame of mind where I can understand that. But that said, there are things about this album that don't particularly hit me in the way that I think that they are meant to, or that just come off as a bit superfluous, or maybe just don't hit the stride that it wants to, just because I feel like once I got a better understanding of what I like in this genre and what I like in music, I had a more developed opinion on this album. Because when I first heard it, I liked it a little tiny bit more than I do now, and I think it's because it is such an overwhelming, intoxicating sensory experience of a record. It sort of cakes you in that distortion and those guitar tones and those distortion pedals. It's a wave. It's not as energetic as something like Ride, but it's also something that's distinctly like, there's almost like a slacker rock influence that you can feel here. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, like the influence of stuff like Pavement can be felt on here. But the cool thing about it is the way that it uses the different types of distortion to sort of overlap onto each other, like a Venn diagram of different sounds, to create a really wholly unique thing. And I think that's one thing about the album that has to be said, is that there are so many different sounds and tones on this album. And the thing is that most of them are in fact guitars, but some of them don't sound like guitars. They are like, a lot of them are distorted and big, but some of these sounds here are distorted beyond like any reasonable measure, to the point where you'll hear sounds that are just like, what is that? And it's like, no, it's actually a guitar. It's just run through so many waves of distortion that you can't fucking tell. Which does make this sound otherworldly. No better showcase than in the opener, Only Shallow, which I think is one of the album's many absolutely divine shining moments. Just a beautiful showcase of how deep and layered and textured this is. Same thing with Loomer too. I think that's a great 1-2 punch. And I will admit, I'm not like super into the stranger, like brief digressions that are on this album, like Touched. I don't really get the intended effect. It just kind of steers away from what the album overall is very good at doing for me, in pursuit of something that feels less substantial and not really, it doesn't evoke anything out of me really. Like it sounds like pretty cool and nice. But then there's To Hear Knows When and When You Sleep, which are terrific fucking songs. If I have a hot take, I don't really like I Only Said. There is the guitar in the background here is so, it's like winding and hypnotic, but it's also really whiny sounding. And for as long as this track goes on, it gets really fucking annoying. Like it's just like it just digs at a part of my brain that I just really, really don't care for. Um, and like, you know, I can understand because it's like this is such an overwhelmingly noisy album. I can certainly see why that wouldn't bother other people because it could just kind of fade into the rest of it here. But when I really zero in on the mix of some of these songs, there are some things that do feel like they achieve something that's a bit more grating. It can be kind of hard on the ears because it's so distorted after a little while, considering it's a decently long album. But that said, right after that, you have Coming Alone and Sometimes, which are very, very good songs. I don't think Coming Alone is quite as good as the heights that are on sort of the first half of the album. Same thing for What You Want. But the real showstopper for me is the closer, which is Soon, which is a fucking amazing song. Like, holy shit. Something I haven't really spoken on is really how the vocals work in this album. And they are very typical of shoegaze and that they aren't really, they're really just meant to be purely sonic. They're like analyzing, you can't hear them half the time. I would actually describe a lot of it as the same effect that Elizabeth Fraser has on many Cocteau Twins records, specifically Heaven or Las Vegas, which obviously a much prettier, brighter, more shimmery album, but it's something that's sort of, it fades into the songs and becomes sort of its own instrument. And the same effect is here, except it's mixed in a way where it feels like it's fuzzier, it's noisier, it's more distorted. And it's interesting to see how this, I think, abrasive and noisy creates something that is overall a mesmerizing textural experience that is very beautiful and enveloping and like blossoming. It's a world of contradictions, and it's so easy to see why so many people fall in love with it. It's just not my particular brand of this sound.
On the note of those vocals, I mean, shout out, what's beautiful about it is we've got a shout out by name. It's obviously Kevin Shields is in there, but Belinda Butcher, her vocal contributions on this record, the tonality of her voice, the way that it interweaves with or like harmonizes or kind of sits atop of Kevin's voice. And then the moments, the sort of show-stopping moments where she has a kind of solo turn, like my favorite, My Bloody Valentine song, one of the most divine pieces of music of the whole 90s to me, which is the track To Hear Knows When, which is a song that feels like it's like dying listening and like it feels like it feels like fucking sending to a different plane of reality. And I hate falling back on descriptions like that because they get repetitive, but it really is just like, to me, and it's not just that either, like a lot of this album for me, it's a sort of otherworldly experience. And I don't mean to speak of it in terms of like purely all of these like superlative, like it's amazing, it's phenomenal, it's amazing and life-changing, even though I do think this is a pretty perfect record. It's not just about the superlatives for me, like in terms of quality, but it's just like I have to use these kind of superlative terms to describe the experience and state of mind this album puts me in, because it's so extra, like it's so intense.
It's hard to isolate those individual components without looking at it from a holistically like sonic standpoint, you know. I kind of empathize with that.
Yeah, and like when, I mean, that opening of Only Shallow with the kind of like drum hit and then the waves of guitar come in, that's become quite an iconic musical moment and just music history, because it's like, that's, you know, that even if you listen to Isn't Anything, their first album before that, that still doesn't prepare you for the sound of the guitars on this record. And what's quite interesting that I've learned is that actually there's not a lot, you might imagine these songs have like 100 tracks of guitars layered atop of each other. They actually have very few, like 2 or 3 on most songs, if that even. It's just that the effects that are being used on those guitars are so like gargantuan and unique and strange and impossible to replicate, that it's difficult to compare the experience of it or the sound of it to anything. It's difficult to have reference points. And so as a result of it, it's just becomes this really unique, enormous, gargantuan thing that's so hard to describe.
I mean, I think the only thing you can compare it to are things that are directly trying to imitate it,
Yeah.
like the numerous covers online from various Japanese, Korean, and American shoegaze artists who there's like 2 or 3 separate like Loveless cover albums floating around on the internet,
Mhm.
which I've listened to parts to. A lot of them don't come nearly close to reaching the impact of this album, but
Yeah.
but there are admittedly a lot of original creative spins which people put on these well established tracks that have such a distinct, unique sound to them.
Yeah, 100% agree. And like a lot of the shoegaze that we've talked about in the past, either reviewing or having talked about being fans of, really like is the DNA of that and the makeup of that is so different from what MBV are doing here anyway. Like it's so hard to compare a band like Slowdive or whoever to MBV, aside from the vague, connections and sort of, because it's not a case of like MBV having influenced a lot of these bands necessarily, because like bands like Slowdive were doing their thing before MBV were doing this anyway. But like, so I think it's quite cool that you brought up like Japanese or like non-Western influences of Loveless, because I think it has permeated into international sort of music and kind of culture beyond just what we're used to in
definitely
US and
like,
UK music.
I think even Paranul, which we reviewed this year, is quite deeply indebted to this album.
And in that review, I made a direct reference to Loveless in terms of talking about that record, that new Paranul record, being like the most significant record for shoegaze as a concept since Loveless. And I still stand by that statement with some distance from it now. And me kind of making a big deal about that statement is, I guess, reflective of like the ginormous stature of this album. And I think it's a weird challenge and also a kind of refreshing task to talk about an album where there's so little you can compare it to. You just have to find ways to describe its world for what it is. And that's a neat, fun little challenge. But anyway, I've rattled plenty. I'd love to hear from you, August, what you think of this record and your relationship with it and the sound of it, how it appeals to you.
So I think I can't remember when I first heard this, but it was a while ago, back when I was very, very early on in my musical journey of like, I want to hear the iconic albums, the staple albums in various genres, and shoegaze is always like intriguing enough to want to venture into. And I remember listening to this first on a bike ride and being very taken just by how it is so overpowering in its own way, despite feeling like if you have your speakers not all the way up, it can sound a little thin, I think, to modern ears, especially in comparison with how heavy certain directions of shoegaze have gone. But that being said, with the full blast headphone experience, this is overwhelming to listen to. I think a track that really comes to mind for me is Sometimes, which has this titanic guitar passage that you could very easily mistake for being a bass, just because of how deep and overwhelming it is. And a lot of this has always felt to me like a very textural experience. And I mean, knowing my music taste, I think that it's an album I really appreciate and love certain tracks on, but for me, the whole experience is not always the most resonant thing. I do find it slipping from my memory at points if I go long enough without listening to it. I find a lot of the impact of it lost, but of course, revisiting it in that perfect condition is what keeps me coming back to it. Like, hearing this album in an empty room on a rainy day is just an ideal experience. It's an album that I think never truly leaves you, in that even if it wanes from your memory over time, it has such a resonant, lasting, unique sound, and a lot of that comes from a track like Only Shallow, which is so harsh and heavy. And I like it when this album is at its harshest and its heaviest and its most brutal sounding, while also feeling tender. And I think yeah, that's kind of my general perspective on it.
Yeah, I like that description you just gave of, like, you know, the album being incredibly harsh but also sort of tender at the same time. It's like it's like overwhelming you with, like, you know, a love, you know, which is weird for a record titled Loveless. But I mean, all of this, I think I've already mentioned it. I want to bang the drum on it again. To Hear Knows When is just an absolutely transcendental musical experience for me. And it's very elementally simple. Like, it's just, there's not a lot of complexity in the melody. In fact, that's true of basically every song here. It's very simple fundamentals, but the wall of sound, the impact that it has, and also I think repetition is quite important. The hypnotic quality that these songs develop through their length is quite key to that as well, and important. I love a track like I Only Said Much More Than Jake does, that I recognize also the fact that central guitar motif, which is incidentally created, I think, through very extreme use of a wah-wah pedal, is, you know, I can understand it being like a cilantro gene sort of thing, where, like, for some people it's just going to be a non-starter, and that's fair. But for me, like, because I'm able to get on board with that, the repetition of it, the sense of, like, hypnotic, you know, waves of sound that song develops, it gets more and more powerful as it goes on. And I obviously can see how it would get more and more grating as it goes on if you're not able to get on board with that for whatever reason. But I find it a consistently sort of really beguiling and beautiful experience. It's an album where this is not like a kind of backhanded negative thing or whatever, nor is it meant to be damning with faint praise, but it's an album where I think very less, like, when I think about what I love about it, I think less about the songs themselves and more about the continual journey the album takes me on through these various passages. And I like the way I think that the switching up of vocal duties between Kevin and Belinda and both of them between songs, so that you're never, like, listening to the same sort of voice consistently, and also, like, the different sort of effects tones that vary between tracks that give a big difference between a song like Blown a Wish, for example, and a song like What You Want. Both underrated deep cuts from later in this record, in my opinion. I think there's enough sort of variation in textural focus and vocal prominence that you do get a sense of real progression and ebb and flow from this album. I think that's emblematized beautifully by Sometimes, which is an utterly gorgeous song. Morgan can't be with us for this review. Unfortunately, he really wanted to, but he has said that Sometimes is one of his favorite songs of this entire 1991 year, which, if you know Morgan, it's high fucking praise from him. Mm-hmm. And he loves this album incidentally as well. So I'm sure he'd be, you know, co-signing a lot of what I'm saying. But yeah, that journey that the hypnotic quality of these songs take you on, as well as having this kind of pop appeal as well. Like one of the most iconic tracks on this record is When You Sleep, which has that kind of classical MBV melody and the vocal, tonality. And it's just so gorgeous and like timeless to me when I listen to it as well. Like it sounds beamed in from another fucking planet. Like it sounds alien. Like it sounds, it doesn't sound recognizably human. And yet it feels like, some kind of extraterrestrial content. I'm going to fucking sound like the fucking Pitchfork Kid A guy in a minute. It's like, it's better than a dead baby. But no, like
big, bright, flashing neon lights. Dead baby.
it sounds extra fucking terrestrial, right? Tell me I'm wrong. It
No, I
sounds,
mean you're
Yeah.
totally right. The
yeah.
I think
And
there's an active effort to make this sound as distinctly alien as possible in a respect, because it's just like the structure and the way that this is constructed is like it's just not traditional, especially for something in 1991. I mean, my God,
like
there
the
just
80s have,
wasn't some.
the 80s are barely dead at this point, and this
Yeah,
shit's rolling out.
imagine
I
giving
mean,
this to someone in something as late as 1988. I feel like would incinerate them.
Yeah. And in a
yeah,
lot of ways, it feels like a culmination as well of a lot of the really noisy, far out stuff that alternative bands were doing in the 80s, like Jesus and Mary Chain, for example, taken to this entirely new level where the harshness aspects are kind of like they're in a weird, ironic way, the harshness is cranked up so much that it stops being harsh and starts being like a kind of pillow of gorgeous like comfort. I think it's meaningful that both Kevin and Belinda had tinnitus at the time they were recording this. And in many ways, like I think for them, the sorts of compositions they made was a kind of like an attempt to overcome the tinnitus, like, and create an enveloping sonic landscape that's like a balm, that's like a fucking, reprieve from the chaos of having to like live with just horrible noise in your head, and attempt to kind of drown that out. And I think the album functions and probably has a sort of a lot of its appeal for the fact that it can be put on to drown out thoughts, to drown out the world around you, and to like be this kind of like hug in audio form.
yeah, that's definitely a large part of the appeal here. That, and I think what's fascinating about this appeal too is just how other bands have tried to take a very similar approach to this like harsh hug, and really applied that in their own way after this. I mean, a band who comes to mind, one track in particular, is Yo La Tengo's Sugar Cube, which takes so much stylistic DNA from this album and transforms it in a way that wouldn't fit on this album, but is still recognizably influenced by it. And I think that's about the best any imitator can do, is make something recognizably influenced, but it still doesn't feel right.
I love, August, that I was not the person to bring up Yo La Tengo in the My Bloody Valentine video. That's very heartwarming to me. Sugar Cube is like ripped, the DNA, core DNA of that song is ripped straight from this album, and yet it is its own transcendently perfect song in its own right. Yeah, and that's cool. Like, it's like MBV laid the groundwork in a sense. They created these opuses, these worlds unto themselves within these songs, and it's like bands would come and they would take that certain elements of that, and then they would refine it into like 2 or 3 minute pop songs. And this is kind of like the template, the textile that future generations of bands would borrow from to adapt into a new like more refined thing. And that's not a diss against this album. In fact, it kind of just emphasizes the kind of totemic nature of it, right? It's like it's like a holy script for a musical genre in a certain sense, and like different people have come and they've interpreted it in different ways and applied it in different ways into their musical world, to draw a really labored metaphor. But they've done that, and always, forever, I think bands will, as long as they're interested in exploring the possibilities of making kooky ass motherfucking sounds with a guitar, they're always going to be drawing from the well of Loveless in some way. And so like it makes it difficult to kind of talk about it like a normal fucking album, although we've done a pretty good job of doing that, I think.
Yeah.
But also like it emphasizes how much of a joy it is to like fucking listen to and think about. And I don't know, I don't know. I can't imagine like, I mean, I can imagine not enjoying the sound of this album, just not being attuned to your tastes. But I can't imagine like having an active hatred towards this. It mystifies me. It's such a fucking like, it's such a not benign, but like it's such a benevolent album, if that makes any fucking sense.
It's 30 years old and it's infiltrated so much of popular rock music. And yet we said nothing still really quite sounds like it, which is such a fucking anomaly. I mean, like you could draw comparison to shit like Boris as far as this album's influence and it's reaching into different sects of rock music. And that's just fucking incredible. I mean, damn.
Yeah, and I make a big deal of it being this kind of like template, but also like as I said before, with a song like When You Sleep, it has a really great sort of poppy sensibility too. I love a kind of famous quote from Brian Eno is that Soon set a new standard for pop and is the vaguest music ever to have been a hit. Like he said that in an endearing way, right? Because it's like this song was a single, it did reasonably well for the band, and yeah, and it's like when you think about this track and you think about like its potential appeal, like, and it has this beautiful sort of pop sensibility about it, but it's also this 7-minute, guitar sort of waves of sound opus. Like it's a beautiful meeting point of like these really far out extreme alternative sounds and like the space of sort of popular alternative music and the weird place that culture was in the early 90s, such that a song like Soon could be a hit even in the UK. Like that's so crazy and cool. And like a lot of this retrospective has been talking about like music where it's like if you really think about how successful it was, it kind of becomes mystifying. And this was a cool year where like, not the first year obviously, but it was a significant year where like really proper weird crazy shit started to really be infiltrating the culture. And I think that Loveless is such an integral part of that story, and in many ways you can see it as this kind of emblem of that, this beautiful emblem of that in this beautifully distilled way, because it's just so like singular in a way that even Nirvana's Nevermind, which is the other big, most significant album of 1991, doesn't quite have that same singularity to it, because we always talk about Nevermind in the context of all of its grunge counterparts. Like that's been a big theme of this retrospective, but we can't talk about Loveless in the context of anything else other than just the world of music and the new frontiers that were being explored in this amazing year. And I think that if we were to think about why we even did this retrospective in the first place, above and beyond just, hey, whole bunch of albums we really love, this is all 1991, let's review them. If we were to think about why we did this, then it's because of albums like Loveless, where you have to describe it, you have to address it, you have to it's almost like a rite of passage for reviewing music in a certain sense, is to try and describe and come to terms with, a record like Loveless that exists in its own space like this. And
I mean, well, if I may build on that a little.
Please do.
This is also kind of what inspired us in the same vein to cover Radiohead, in a sense, tackling this mountain. And really, I think that's kind of a thesis statement you make for this whole year of this channel. Just attempting, now that we are doing this for our first full year, attempting to take what we have and do something even larger and grander, which is not only what we're trying to do, but what this album is doing. It's taking like these very elemental ideas, just a lot of dissonant things that don't work separately, but then combining them into this titanic large thing. And I think it's awesome.
I mean, beautifully fucking said. So, favorite tracks and ratings then for My Bloody Valentine's Loveless. Jake, why don't you go first?
My three favorite tracks are Only Shallow, To Hear Knows When, and Soon. Least favorite track is I Only Said, and I give the album a 7.
All right. My three favorite tracks are Only Shallow, When You Sleep, and Sometimes. Least favorite is Touched. And this is going to be an anomaly because I'm going to give the Shoegaze album a higher rating than Jake. It's a 7.5 from me.
That's the only time that'll happen.
Morgan's three favorite tracks are Sometimes, To Hear Knows When, and Soon. His least favorite is Touched, and Morgan gives the album an 8.5. And we are going to continue the ascent here. My three favorite tracks are To Hear Knows When, Sometimes, and I'm going to shout out something. I'm going to shout out a deep cut. I'm going to shout out Blown a Wish. Why the fuck not? I love that song. And to me, like, yeah, I think I agree that something like Touched is a least essential moment. It could definitely have been cut. To me, it's akin to some of the other moments on this record where it's like at the end of a song, you'll just have this little wee extra nugget of music that is just kind of there. And I don't mind those things, especially because to me, like, it's such a front to back listen. And I have thought about this really, really hard. I've rethought about whether this album is still a 10 for me or not. And I've decided that it still is. I just think this album is front to back. I wouldn't change a thing about it. When I listen to the experience of it, I never get sick of it. So yeah, it's a 10 from me, perhaps somewhat predictably. And that means that the album on the whole has an average rating of 8.3.
Yeah.
Let us know what you think of the album in the comments below. We want to hear from you. But before we finish up, since we've reached the end of the retrospective, we've decided the fun thing to do would be to kind of have a final sort of reflection on how this retrospective has gone. And actually, we've done 17 albums. Let's rank them all individually. And I also have the ranking of our compiled average ratings as well. So
and that'll be the last one to come out, I take it.
Yeah. So let's kind of have a last sort of reflection on how the year has gone. Jake, what's been the sort of highlights and lowlights of the retrospective for you, and how would you rank the albums?
Well, I mean, it was just a final time getting to look back in 30 years into the past to see what the landscape of music was like. And I'd get to enjoy some albums that I hadn't really heard before, and some albums that maybe I wasn't over the moon about, but still got to see into a greater cultural window, I guess. But my ranking here at number 17, not gonna make any friends with this one, U2's Octung Baby.
Ooh.
Number 16, Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magic. Number 15, REM's Out of Time. Number 14, Teenage Fan Club's Bandwagon-esque. Number 13, De La Soul is Dead. Number 12, Nirvana's Nevermind. 11 is Loveless. 10 is Blue Lines by Massive Attack. 9 is Primal Scream's Screamadelica. Number 8 is the self-titled Temple of the Dog. Number 7, The Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest. Number 6, Gish by the Smashing Pumpkins. Number 5, Talk Talk, Laughing Stock. Number 4 is Slint's Spiderland. Number 3, Queen's Innuendo. Number 2, Pearl Jam's 10. And number 1, Soundgarden's Bad Motor Finger by only 10 of the 1991 retrospective.
Hell yes. Let's fucking go. August.
All right. So my reflection on this retrospective, some, as I said at the start, some were good, some were bad. We all know which ones. Yeah, I know it was fun to do this. I didn't love everything we covered, but there was nothing I wouldn't want to not cover, even if certain albums made me very infuriated. They were fun to do.
So what do you think? Do you think 1991 is the greatest year for music of all time ever?
No, I don't think no, I didn't have a 10 in the retrospective, but that's not surprising. I don't give 10s on this show.
You had a couple that I'd imagine were, not a million miles away from the district that 10 lives in.
Admittedly not. There are some that occupy that same kind of spot in my heart, so to speak. But anyway, without further ado, number 17, predictably, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blood Sugar Sex Magic. Number 16, U2, Achtung Baby. Number 15, REM, Out of Time. Number 14, Queen, Innuendo. Number 13, Smashing Pumpkins, Gish. Number 12, Primal Scream, Screamadelica. Number 11, Nirvana, Nevermind. Number 10, Teenage Fan Club, Bandwagon-esque. I did that only for the meme. Thought it was funny. Number 9, De La Soul is Dead. Number 8, Temple of the Dog. Number 7, Soundgarden, Bad Motor Finger. Number 6, A Tribe Called Quest, The Low End Theory. Number 5, My Bloody Valentine, Loveless. Number 4, Pearl Jam, 10. Number 3, Massive Attack, Blue Lines, and I slaved over which was going to come out on top. But number 2 is Laughing Stock, and number 1 is Slint's Spiderland.
Wow. I didn't know how that was going to turn out in the end. So there we have it.
It was a tough decision.
All right. Well, I have Morgan's list here. He hasn't included the U2 album because he didn't listen to it, which is understandable. And he has also included some additional albums that we didn't review in the retrospective that I'll leave out. But obviously, he thinks very highly of Death's Human, Mr. Bungle, and maybe not so highly about the Metallica's Black Album. But Morgan's ranking, number 16 is Teenage Fan Club's Bandwagon-esque. Number 15 is REM's Out of Time. Number 14 is Primal Scream's Screamadelica. Number 13 is Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magic. Number 12 is Nirvana's Nevermind. Number 11 is Smashing Pumpkins' Gish. Number 10 for Morgan is De La Soul is Dead. Number 9 is Queen's Innuendo. Number 8 is My Bloody Valentine's Loveless. Number 7 is A Tribe Called Quest, The Low End Theory. Number 6 is Massive Attack's Blue Lines. Number 5 is Temple of the Dog, self-titled. Number 4 is Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger. Number 3 is Slint's Spiderland. Morgan's number 2 is Talk Talk's a Laughing Stock, and his number 1 is, of course, Pearl Jam's 10. As for my ranking, at number 17, the bottom of the list, breaks my heart to do this because I love this band, REM's Out of Time. Number 16 for me is Teenage Fan Club, Bandwagon-esque. Number 15 is Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blood Sugar Sex Magic. And I just broke some hearts putting that above Bandwagon-esque. Number 14 is Queen's Innuendo. Number 13 is Tribe Called Quest's Low End Theory. Definitely made some people mad by putting that low. Number 12 is Temple of the Dog, self-titled. Number 11 is Primal Scream, Screamadelica. And my top 10 from our retrospective, number 10 is Gish. Number 9 is Nevermind. Number 8 is Blue Lines. Number 7 is Tung Baby. Number 6 is Pearl Jam's 10. Number 5 is Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger. How the fuck is that only number 5? Number 4 is De La Soul is Dead. Number 3 is Loveless. Number 2 is Spiderland. And number 1 for me is Laughing Stock. So some interesting agreements and disagreements. And I have the overall ranking with, helpfully, our average ratings. The lowest ranked album by the group of us in the retrospective is at number 17, Blood Sugar Sex Magic by the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Womp womp.
at an average rating of 4.3.
Ouch.
Leaping up from there, number 16 is REM's Out of Time with an average rating of 5.4. You know, it's still a good album. It's just kind of mediocre, and REM have a lot of better albums. In case anyone's out there who didn't watch that video and thinks that we're just haters. Number 15, U2's Tung Baby. Had to get my real fill of that because I'll never probably get to say it again on this podcast. 5.8 average. Number 14, Teenage Fan Club, Bandwagon-esque, 6.0 average. Number 13, Gish, Smashing Pumpkins, leaping up to a 7.2 average.
Oh, okay.
Number 12, Primal Scream, Screamadelica with a 7.3 average. Number 11, Nevermind by Nirvana with a 7.5 average. And we're at the top 10, Tribe Called Quest, Low End Theory, 7.8 average. The next is actually two records that are tied for 8th, which is De La Soul is Dead at 7.9 and Queen's Innuendo at 7.9. Then at 7, we have Temple of the Dog with an 8.2 average. My Bloody Valentine's Loveless with an 8.3 average. Massive Attack's Blue Lines is number 5 with an 8.5 average. We then have another tie for 3rd place, which is Bad Motorfinger and 10, fittingly enough, both on the same score of 9.1. And in 2nd place, drum roll, Talk Talk's Laughing Stock, and number 1 album of the year, according to our aggregated average, is Slint's Spiderland with a 9.5 average. Definitely no bias from the Kentucky gang. It's just that good. But at this point, we want you at home to let us know what you have thought of the 1991 retrospective. What were your favorite albums? What were your least favorite albums? Did you enjoy our discussions? Did we miss any albums out in the retrospective that you feel we should have covered? Let us know. And we deliberately did not cover Use Your Illusion, even though it's one of the biggest albums of 1991, because fuck that.
Bad.
Guns and Roses are not a good band.
Wow, you're really
good night, Seattle. We love you.
Igniting a flame war with that incredibly hot statement. But yeah, let us know. Let us know what you think. And of course, this being the Loveless video, what you think of Loveless as well. We really want to hear from you in the comments below. We love reading all your comments. Every single one means a lot to us, and of course helps us out as well. So make sure you like the video if you enjoyed it. And make sure you subscribe if you haven't already as well, because we put out a lot of videos. We're going to be taking a break from retrospectives for a wee bit, and we're going to come back eventually. I think in December is the current plan, but it might end up being early January with our next artist retrospective, which is going to be a much shorter and punchier one than our last one, which is going to be on the Dillinger Escape Plan. Finally, we might be able to get August into metalcore. We'll see. The time will tell.
We will see how that goes.
We will see how that goes. But yeah, so till then, we'll be kind of giving ourselves a little bit of a break, but still keeping up with our regular content on Sundays and Tuesdays, as well as additional videos as well that are being worked on in the background and will be revealed with time. But yeah, if you want to check out the other videos we've done in this retrospective, we'll make sure there's a link to the full playlist in the description. I'm sure Jake can probably do the thing where he puts it on the video screen when I talk about it as well. But yeah, check out the playlist in case you haven't already. 17 albums we reviewed, and I think every single video we did is pretty damn good considering, all the other shit we've been doing on top of it. But yeah, that's it. That's all there is to it. August, why don't you lead us out of the retrospective for the final time?
I mean, shit, as always, rock over London, rock on Chicago, AMC. There's always something more.